Hey everyone, welcome back to my YouTube channel. I hope you're having a beautiful day and thanks so much for joining me for another art tutorial. In today's tutorial, I'm going to be sharing my process for this fun, fall-inspired watercolor composition. I'm going to be sharing my preliminary pencil sketching process with you, some tips that are going to help you also create your sketches freehand if that's what you're looking to do. And then I'll be moving on to sharing my actual painting process with you and the techniques that I use to create a little bit of dimension and interest, variation in hues and values in all of these different elements included using just one layer of paint and a very minimal amount of detail after that. I used only 6 different colors for this piece, and this is something that I've talked about in the past, how I like limiting the amount of colors that I'm using and repeating colors either in different sections of my paintings, different elements in my paintings, or repeating colors in my color mixtures, because color plays such a huge role in bringing in a sense of harmony and making things look coherent and well integrated in a visual composition. I'll be explaining how I prepare my different color mixtures, and you're gonna notice how I repeat my colors in my different color mixtures. For this watercolor piece, I used a combination of pretty accessibly priced supplies. These are all student grade supplies, and I really wanted to show you guys that you can create awesome looking artwork using supplies that are not too expensive and not super high in quality, and you can still progress your skills perfectly fine. And this is actually what I used in the beginning of my own art journey and things that I still use when I am teaching classes or working on smaller studies and explorations. I'm going to be working with 6 half pans from my Van Gogh botanical paint set. I'm going to use paper from Strathmore. This one is cold press and 140 pounds. And I'm just going to be working right on this pad. And then for my paintbrushes, these are all from a pack of 7 round brushes that I bought from Amazon from a brand called Magritte. I think they were 7 paintbrushes for like $12 or $13 or something like that. I've been using them quite a bit for months and they've been working pretty well for me. I'm gonna go ahead and share my preliminary sketching process. I've often mentioned in the past how I like using an HB pencil super lightly on my watercolor paper so that I can erase my mistakes easily as I continue adding in my different elements, and also so that I don't scratch or damage my paper, and also so that my pencil is not visible through my paint at the end because watercolor is translucent. Now, this particular drawing is a drawing that I created from imagination. So I wanted to create a fun, fall-inspired piece, and the first thing that I did was I did some brainstorming. I sat down and thought of different elements that I wanted to bring into this fall-inspired composition. I thought of bringing in pumpkins, maybe an acorn, sunflowers, etc. A bunch of different things that I didn't even end up using. And after doing that, I chose the ones that I wanted to go with. I looked for some reference photos, not to really copy the reference photo, but to just get an idea of the main characteristics of the object so that I could actually make sure that these things that I would be drawing and painting would actually look like what I wanted them to look like. I wasn't really aiming for super high levels of realism in this piece. It's more of a quicker, looser illustration, but it's always super helpful to get reference photos or see what something looks like in real life so that you can pick and choose what things you want to bring into your piece. It's difficult to remember all of these nuances and all the characteristics of all of these different objects and subjects that we can choose to draw or paint. And so using references and having things in front of you in real life that you can observe and study and notice those characteristics in order to bring them into your artwork is always super helpful, especially if you're going for mid to higher levels of realism in your pieces. I wanted this little arrangement or composition to have more width than height to it. I wanted it to be more kind of horizontal than it was vertical. And so what I decided to do was first focus on placing the largest, most important elements, I guess you could say, in the center. And then I kind of organized the secondary and tertiary and fillers, elements that I would be using as fillers around them and next to them. Something that I found super helpful is actually creating a quick thumbnail sketch on a separate sketchbook. And I decided on my arrangement overall, how large the different elements would be and their location, and then I went ahead and sketched this out on my watercolor sheet. I wanted to make sure that I had an understanding of how big or how small things would be, their location within space, how things would be overlapping in this arrangement, that I didn't have too many elements or too few elements. And once I was happy with that thumbnail, I went ahead and sketched it out on my watercolor sheet very lightly, and I started just building it up from there. Now, I also went through the same process in which I always get started with the largest elements or general shapes first, and I make my way towards smaller elements and specifics. If you go back to the beginning of the sketching process, you're going to notice that I started with the pumpkins in the center, which are the largest elements. And I even started sketching them in as what I like to call envelopes, which I've explained in past freehand sketching videos. I'm going to make sure to leave links to them down below in case you haven't checked them out, because I go much more into depth in terms of how I create my freehand sketches in that video. And I talk about the envelope method and how I create believable proportions and use my space wisely, effectively, and all of that. But I always like getting started with largest general shapes first, and I make my way towards the smaller shapes and details only after the largest shapes have been achieved successfully. I also don't worry about getting curves perfectly right in the beginning. I actually lay down blockier shapes and straighter lines and segments. And then later on, I refine my shapes once I'm happy with proportions and locations and whatnot. I'm going to be paying attention to the shapes that I've created for myself with my pencil throughout the painting process pretty much completely, except for the petals of the sunflowers. I'm sure those are going to change quite a bit when I start painting them. I may make some of them slightly larger or smaller, or decide to leave some of them out or even add more in. When it comes to painting petals, at least in the style that I'm going to be using for this piece, I'm going to be painting them in pretty loosely, and they are very irregular. So more so, I added them into my sketch to just visualize and have an idea of how large they would be and how many petals approximately I would be adding into my different sunflowers. All right, so I finished up with my pencil sketch. You can see how light it is. And at the very end, I usually like tapping my kneaded eraser over my entire sketch to lighten my lines a little bit more and to get rid of any excess graphite that might be floating around, which may affect my bright colors that I'm gonna be adding on top next. Okay, so pencil sketch is ready. I am moving on to creating my initial color mixtures that are gonna help me get started with my painting process. So the 6 colors that I'm going to be using for this piece are Indian Yellow, Permanent Red Light, Burnt Sienna, Van Dyke Brown, Hooker's Green Deep, and Permanent Blue Violet. You by no means have to use these exact colors that I am going to be using. I would recommend you use whatever you have on hand that's close to what I am using. And I'm going to be swatching out all of these colors for you on paper so that you can see what they look like and you can pick and choose what's right for you depending on what you have on hand. Now, my objective when I am creating all of these different color mixtures is that I am preparing myself and I am setting myself up for success. I know exactly what I am going to be doing, what colors I'm going to be dropping into each and every single element that I've added in to my composition, in order to develop a nice variety of both hue or color and values in all of my different elements. So what this means is I want to make sure that I have at least 2 to 3 colors prepared for each of the elements in my painting so that I can make sure that I'm going to be quickly able to develop lighter areas, mid-tone areas, and darkest dark areas in all of my different elements, because this is what's going to add dimension to them and create a sensation of light and shadow and a little bit more of a realistic and interesting look, as opposed to keeping everything flat with one same color and value all throughout. But as I said in the beginning of this video, I repeat many of the same colors in my different color mixtures. And I make sure that all of my color mixtures are nice and juicy. I want to make sure that they have a good amount of pigmentation in them, but also some flow to them, that they have some water in them as well, so that I can really load up my paintbrush bristles well and go in and paint quickly. I'm aiming for approximately 50% paint, 50% water in my color mixtures, so that they're not too dry and not too watery either. I want to go in with a good flow in my paintbrush, but also a good amount of color in it as well. Now, let me tell you exactly which colors I am preparing for myself on my color mixing palette, starting at the top. The top color is just plain Indian yellow with some water in it. And then right below that, I created a mix of Indian yellow plus permanent red light. Right underneath that, I have some burnt sienna with some water in it. And then under the burnt sienna, the first green is Indian yellow plus Hooker's green deep. I wanted to create a lighter green, a medium green, and a darker green. In the last rectangular well on my color mixing palette, I once again mixed my Indian yellow plus my Hooker's green deep, only this time it was heavier on the Hooker's green deep and it had less of the yellow in it, because I wanted this green to be darker than the previous green. So it's the same two colors, just at different ratios in both mixtures. In the bottom circular well on my color mixing palette, the darkest green that I've prepared is just plain Hooker's green deep plus some water in it. So you can see how I have a lighter green, a medium green, and a darker green. Then going up from there, I prepared a light golden brown for myself by mixing together some burnt sienna plus a bit of Indian yellow. Right on top of that, I'm creating a darker brown for myself, which I'm going to be using in the twigs and also the stems of the pumpkins and other things here and there. And this is a darker brown that I created by mixing together my burnt sienna plus my Van Dyke brown. Van Dyke brown is a darker, deeper brown. So this is going to darken the burnt sienna quite a bit. Right on top of that, this is just plain Van Dyke brown plus some water in it. So in other words, I also created a lighter brown, a medium brown, and a darker brown for myself. And finally, right on top of that, in the first circular well on my color mixing palette, that is just plain permanent blue violet with some water in it. So I'm going to go ahead and swatch out all of these different colors on this scrap piece of watercolor paper for you guys so that you can see what they look like. And you can get an understanding of how I have a range of colors that I can use for my pumpkins, both the orange pumpkin and the green pumpkin, and the different greenery elements all throughout. I prepared myself with browns that I could use for the stems, for the twigs that I'm going to be adding in. I have lighter browns, mid-tone browns, and darker browns for my acorns. I'm preparing myself with a combination of different colors that I can drop into my fall leaves. And I even prepared some of my purple for the little berries that I'm going to be throwing in here and there. So with this range of colors, I'm all set. These colors have me covered in terms of, I know I'm going to be able to develop a wide range of values and also hues in all of my different elements. Watercolor painting is a super fluid process in which you're constantly changing the ratios of your colors in your color mixtures. You're also changing the paint to water ratios in your color mixtures. If you want your colors to look even lighter, then you have to add more water. And if you want them to look darker and more saturated, then you add more paint in. But it's a very fluid process, and this is by no means all of the paint that I'm going to be using throughout my painting process. Some of my colors are going to run out along the way. They're going to dry up on my color mixing palette, and I'm going to have to reactivate them with some water or creating more paint. And that's normal and it's okay. And the more you practice, the more you start doing this intuitively. But by preparing my different color mixtures and making sure that I know how I'm going to be creating my different values throughout these elements and how I'm going to be bringing in different hues in my different elements, I know exactly what colors I'm going to have to reach for when I do run out of my different paint colors and I have to create more. There is no guessing, there is no kind of further thinking involved because I've already planned out my colors and I have actually even taken them out of my entire paint set so that I don't accidentally start bringing in more colors that I wasn't really intending to bring in. And again, just like I mentioned in the beginning of this video, I like really limiting the amount of colors that I'm going to be using, and by doing this repetition, you notice probably that I repeated different colors in my different color mixtures. I know that everything is going to look well integrated and very cohesive at the end. All right, so this little stack of colors that I have on the right are the colors that I'm going to be using for the orange pumpkin. Next to that are the greens that I'm going to be using for the green pumpkin. Next to that, I have the colors that I'm going to be using in the acorns. Then the purple is what I'm going to be using for the berries because they're very, very small. And just with one same color, I can create at least a little bit of different values by using the same violet in a slightly more watered down state, and in other cases, in a more saturated state with a little bit more paint in it. And then when it comes to everything else for the leaves, I can really go in with whatever combination of greens I want. And I can even drop in some of my orangish colors to make them look like fall leaves. And then the stems of the pumpkins and the central part of the sunflowers are going to be painted in with a couple of different browns that I also use for the acorns and for the pumpkin stems. So hopefully by me explaining all of this, you're kind of getting an idea of how I simplify things for myself so that my process can go much smoothly and I have more of a chance of arriving at a great cohesive outcome, and also limiting my colors and repeating my colors. I cannot recommend enough planning and preparing the colors that you're going to be using throughout your painting process, especially if you're just getting started with watercolor and understanding color and color mixing. All right, so I'm all done with my color mixtures. I changed my water because I want to make sure that I get started with clean water in my container. I'm going to be using 3 different round brushes for this entire piece, and the sizes of these brushes are 6, 4, and 2. And I just switch between them depending on the size of the area on hand. Throughout this entire painting process, I use the exact same overall method to paint all of these different elements in. So I decided to get started with the orange pumpkin, and the 3 colors that I prepared for myself for the orange pumpkin are my unmixed Indian yellow, my orange that I created by mixing together my Indian yellow with my permanent red lights, and the darkest color that I'm going to be using to push darker areas is the burnt sienna. I start with the lightest color of the group that I have prepared for myself for the elements on hand in a pretty translucent state, meaning I initially go in with just a small amount of color in my paintbrush and it's pretty watered down. I also leave some sections of my paper shining through completely unpainted, which are going to be my highlights. And these are little shapes that just happen naturally as I go in and loosely move my paintbrush around in different ways. Sometimes pressing down the belly of my paintbrush more, and sometimes using primarily the tip to paint in that initial shape. And then while that initial layer of paint is still wet, I drop in the second color and then the darkest color after that. So I make my way from lightest color towards the darker color, making sure that the initial layer of paint is still wet before I drop in the next color, because otherwise I'm not going to create those nice wet on wet, diffused out organic effects. So you need to make sure that you're going in with a good amount of paint and that you're working relatively fast. Because if your paint starts to dry on you, then the second or the third color that you drop in, it's not really going to expand out and merge into the previous color. What I like doing to ensure that that initial lightest layer is not going to start drying on me way too fast is I make sure to run the bristles of my paintbrush with that first color all throughout that shape 2 to 3 times before dropping in my next color. You can see how I am approaching painting this pumpkin in separate sections, one section at a time, and I am doing my best to leave at least pieces or little slivers of paper shining through in between each section. This is going to help me visually divide those sections. It's an easy way to separate these sections, and it doesn't have to be a perfect line that you create from top all the way to the bottom. And in fact, I don't want to create any perfect lines. My shapes do merge together here and there, but if I don't leave little slivers of paper here and there in between these sections that I am painting in, then most likely than not, this is not going to look very much like a pumpkin, and it's just going to look like a blob of color. So make sure that you are carefully leaving slivers of paper shining through unpainted as you make your way from section to section. You want to make sure as well that you're only dropping a bit of that second and third color at a time, because at the end you want all of these different sections to show the lighter color, the medium color, and the darker color, so that you can create a nice sense of dimension to what you're painting. A few weeks ago, I shared a step-by-step tutorial in which I explain this technique that you're seeing me use today. And you can see me paint all sorts of different pumpkin shapes using different combinations of colors using this technique. And so if you would find it helpful to practice painting pumpkins in isolation before jumping into painting a full composition with a bunch of different elements in it, I would highly recommend checking out that tutorial. I'm going to make sure to leave a link for you down below in the description box of this video in case you'd like to go and check it out and practice the same technique, painting isolated pumpkins in different colors in a much less overwhelming way. All right, so I finished up with that first pumpkin, and now I am doing the exact same thing with this second green pumpkin. So the three colors that I prepared for this pumpkin are my three greens, obviously, my lighter green that was created by mixing together Indian yellow with Hooker's Green Deep, my second medium green that I created with the same color combo, only this one is heavier on the Hooker's Green than the yellow, and then the darker green is just pure Hooker's Green with some water in it. You can see me use the exact same method. I am going in initially with the lighter color of the bunch in a pretty translucent watered down state, and then running my paintbrush bristles over the entire shape, trying to make my way around the little highlights, the little specks of unpainted white paper that I've left unpainted to stand in place for my highlights. And then I drop in the second color in certain sections that I want to darken within that. And then finally the darkest color and even smaller sections that I want to darken further within the second color. In the second pumpkin, you can also see me leave slivers or little elongated abstract shapes of that paper unpainted in between each one of these sections for this pumpkin. And you can see me constantly use my absorbent towel right there that I have on my left. I am constantly staying on top of water control, making use of my absorbent towel, removing the excess water from my paintbrush bristles by sometimes touching the tip of my bristles on my absorbent towel before jumping in. Whenever I feel I have way too much water or paint in my paintbrush bristles, I tap the tip of my bristles on my absorbent towel before jumping in. Or whenever I feel I've accidentally dropped in way too much water or paint for this shape that I am painting, I dab my paintbrush bristles on my absorbent towel and then go back in to sometimes use the bristles of my paintbrush as a little absorbent sponge to pick up that excess paint and water, and then I continue painting. Staying on top of water control is super important. I never paint with this medium without having my absorbent towel or regular kitchen paper towels beside me at all times. Your absorbent towel or your kitchen paper towel, whatever it is that you use, just help yourself with that along the way. Whenever it is that you accidentally drop in way too much color or water, go in while that is still wet to do some quick lifting. You can also, as I said, use your clean and semi-damp bristles of your paintbrush as a little absorbent sponge. And also, every single time I go into my container of water, I very gently scrape my bristles along the top of the container there so that I'm not dripping water all over the place. And the smaller the shapes that you are painting in, the more important it is that you don't go in with way too much water in your paintbrush bristles, because it's very easy for you to start losing control and to have just end up having just one flat color in that area. It is really my objective to create at least a subtle hint of different values and colors, even in the smallest areas. I don't want any single area in my painting to appear flat. You always want to make sure that you switch between your different paintbrush sizes depending on the size of the area that you're painting in. So you can see me right here get started with the smallest shapes in this green pumpkin. And for this, I switched to my size 4 round brush because I thought this would allow me to have more control. This is my size 4 paintbrush that I am using right here. And you can see how even in these smaller, more narrow sections along the edges of this green one, I've also developed a nice variety of different greens and green values. So I'm all ready to get started with painting in the stems, and I switched on over to my size 2 round brush, my smallest brush. And you probably saw me just a moment ago use my scrap piece of watercolor paper, which is also something that I always make sure to have on hand when I am painting with watercolor, in order to test out color and transparency before going into my painting with my different color mixtures. And what I'm doing right here is I'm doing shorter kind of upwards flicking motions as I am painting in the stem to create a little bit of a wood texture. But same thing with the stems. Initially, I went in with my lighter brown, and then while that initial lighter brown was still wet, I dropped in a little bit of a darker brown. I think I used 2 different browns for my stems. The first one is my burnt sienna plus Van Dyke brown color mixture, heavier on the burnt sienna. And then the second darker brown was plain Van Dyke brown to darken certain sections within that. And you can see how even in the stems, I left little teeny tiny specks of white paper shining through that create a look of highlights in these little stems. And even in the stems, I created a nice, at least a couple of different values in them so that I could add dimension even to these stems. After painting in the stems, I got started with the acorns. I wanted to create a distinction between the top part of the acorn and the bottom part of the acorn. Some of the reference photos that I saw showed the top part of the acorn being overall lighter in value than the bottom part, and in others it was kind of the other way around. But in any case, I wanted to make sure that the kind of general local value of the top part was different from the bottom part, whether it was lighter or darker. So for the top part, I use a combo of my lightest golden brown, which is the burnt sienna plus the Indian yellow. And then while that initial lighter golden brown was in there still wet, I dropped in my second brown, which is my burnt sienna plus a bit of Van Dyke brown. And then for the bottom section, which I wanted to make darker overall when compared to the top part, I actually went in with the middle brown first, the burnt sienna plus Van Dyke brown. And while that initial layer of medium brown was still wet, I dropped in my darkest brown, which is the pure Van Dyke brown. So hopefully you can see how I'm creating a variety of values and hues within both sections of the acorn. And again, these are very small shapes, so I'm making sure to drop in just a bit of color at a time, especially when I start dropping in that second color or even my third color. I don't want those to completely overtake the lighter colors. I need the lighter colors to be there, right? I want a variety of values. And so if I ever find myself dropping in way too much color, I stop, I remove the color from my paintbrush bristles, and I go back in with a clean and slightly damp paintbrush and lift up that excess color while it's still wet. Now, as I move on painting all of these different elements and sections of different elements, I bring to mind the textures of these different parts that I saw in those reference photos or that I know of because maybe I've seen these things in real life. And if there's any way that I can shift and change the way that I am using my painting tool, so my paintbrush, meaning sometimes maybe I am just using the tip of the paintbrush. Other times I'm pressing down the belly of my paintbrush a little bit more. Sometimes I'm using upwards short strokes in the case of those stems. Other times I'm moving my paintbrush more of in a sideways position, etc. and so on. If there's any way that I can change the way that I'm using my paintbrush in order to not only communicate color and develop different values, but also some sort of texture at the same time, then I go ahead and do it. Especially with this kind of piece, because I want to be able to do as much as possible in terms of that description of color, value, texture, etc. with just one layer of paint. I want to keep this relatively loose and fresh and easy, and keep the detail that I'm going to be adding in later after everything has dried to a minimum. All right, so I finished up with those acorns, and it was time to move on to painting in the central part of these sunflowers. For the central part of the sunflowers, I'm using my 3 browns. But I'm doing the exact same thing, in which initially I am going in with the lightest brown, which is the lightest golden brown. That's a mixture of burnt sienna plus Indian yellow. Then I go in and drop in some of my medium brown, my burnt sienna plus Van Dyke brown. And then finally, I darken certain sections within that with my pure Van Dyke brown. The smaller sunflower on the right is partially covering up the larger sunflower behind it. And I wanted to make sure that I tackled painting in at least most of the petals on the one in front before painting in the one behind it. It's always super important to have in mind what elements are overlapping on top of what elements, so that you can make a strategy for yourself and decide how it's best to tackle them in terms of what order you're going to be painting them in. Because if not, you can end up painting something or a section of something that is actually going to be covered up by something else and really shouldn't be visible. And you're not going to be able to erase that or cover it up with another layer of paint, because watercolor is transparent. There is no way to get rid of that paint that you've already placed on paper. So it's always super important to give thought to how certain sections of things might be overlapping on top of each other and decide what order to tackle them in. After that, it was time to start painting in their petals. And for the petals, I'm really just using 2 different colors. I am going in initially with a translucent version of my Indian yellow, and then dropping in a bit of my orange, my mix of Indian yellow plus permanent red light on top in certain sections of those petals to create a nice variety in hues and values in those petals. After painting in the petals in the second sunflower, I'm gonna go ahead and paint in the central section of the 3rd largest sunflower behind this one, which I had left for after painting in these petals. So I go in with my size 4 round brush, which I feel is appropriate for the size of the shape. Initially, I go in with my lightest golden brown, then with my medium brown, and finally I go in to drop in some of my Van Dyke brown. And after I'm done with that, I'm gonna allow that central section to dry before painting in the petals of this sunflower, so that I don't have these browns merging into my yellows and oranges in the petals. Watercolor is always going to expand into paper that is wet. So when you don't want any merging or bleeding of colors to occur, then it's important that you allow that to dry completely before moving forward. So what I do here is I skip on over to working on painting in the leaves. And really, you can choose whichever combination of colors that you've prepared to paint in the leaves. All of these different colors that we have prepared here would work well for fall leaves. What I did was I just chose a combo of 2 colors for my leaves. I went with the lighter green and the orange, but really you could do yellow and orange, orange and burnt sienna, dark green and lighter green, light green and brown, whichever color combo you want to go with. I would recommend picking 2 different colors for your leaves. And then it's best to go in initially with the lightest color of whichever pair or 3 colors you choose for yourself. And then make sure that that is nice and wet, and then drop in the second color so that you can have that nice wet on wet diffused out look. I'm just going to advance a few of these leaves. While that central section of the last sunflower dries, and then once I feel it's dry enough, I'm going to go ahead and start painting in the petals for this last one. Right around here, you're gonna see me do some lifting of paint that has already dried. I wanna go in and add a little bit more dimension into the central sections of these sunflowers, make them look a little bit more raised. I feel that those dark browns have flattened these sections a little bit too much. So what I do after having worked on those petals was I remove all of the yellow and oranges from my paintbrush bristles, and I go in with a clean and slightly damp paintbrush. I do gentle scrubbing in these sections where I want to pull up or lift up some of that paint, and then I go in with my absorbent towel and lift up that paint. This lifting made a huge difference, especially in the larger one on the right. When I did some lifting in the central section of the sunflower, this gave it a lot more dimension. And you can turn back the video just a few seconds so that you can see how doing this lifting really helps bring a little bit more dimension into sections that you have perhaps flattened out a little bit too much. Now, how much lifting you can do of that color after it's already dried is entirely going to depend on the type of paper and quality of paper that you're using, the quality of the paint that you're using, and even the specific pigment that you're using, because even within the same watercolor paint set, different colors have different characteristics and properties. Some colors are way more staining than others, and those you're not going to be able to lift as much. Some papers soak up and hold on to that paint so strongly that you're not going to be able to lift up that color, while other papers allow you to do lifting a lot more. However, even with the lifting, it's important just to know that when working with watercolor, most likely than not, you're not going to be able to go back to the whiteness that the paper once had in the beginning after it has already received some amount of paint. This said, doing very gentle scrubbing and some lifting can really help you fix some little accidents that might have happened. But when you're doing scrubbing and lifting, you want to make sure that you're doing it very gently and that you don't overdo it, because even though we're working on paper that is intended for water-soluble mediums, it is still paper, and paper is fragile, and it's very important not to overdo it. It's very easy to overwork your paper and start damaging it, and that is also something that you're not going to be able to take back. Okay, so I continued working on my leaves. You can see how I decided to use a darker combination of greens, or a combination of greens that led to a darker overall look for the sunflower leaves. For the sunflower leaves, I used my medium green and my darker green. I tried dropping in the darker green where it would make sense that the petal area is creating a cast shadow on the leaves, or where leaves are covering each other up and not allowing that light to hit that leaf or section of leaf beneath it. After painting those in, I went ahead and got started with these smaller leaves below them on the left. And for those, I also used a different color combination. I went in with the medium green and then I dropped in the orange. Then I jumped on over to painting in these very small leaves that I added at the top. I am using my size 4 round brush, but these are so tiny that I could have also painted them in with my size 2, my smallest brush that I chose for this painting process. Some of these I'm painting in with the lighter green, and others I'm painting in with the medium green. For the most part, I don't use 2 different greens in one same tiny little leaf, because these are so small that I'm pretty sure that the second color would completely overtake the first. However, I do make sure that at the end, in this entire kind of a strand of leaves, if you will, there is a variety in hues and translucencies. I then skip on over to painting in the random fallen leaves that are really not connected to any specific branch or anything that I added in at the bottom. And I want to encourage you to explore different color combinations for your different leaves. I decided to go in with my lighter green and my orange in those. And then I finally moved on to painting in the berries. And for this, I am using my smallest size 2 round brush, of course. I want to go in super carefully and make sure that I am leaving a teeny tiny highlight, at least in the majority of these berries, so that I can create a bit of a shiny look to them. Once the berries were painted in, I removed all of the purple from my paintbrush bristles, and I painted in the stem for the berries, or the twig for the berries, I don't know what that would be, with one of my browns. That's my Van Dyke brown that I used for that. I added a little bit of my medium brown color mixture into my medium green color mixture and painted in the stems, or the little branch for the leaves in the bottom right. And you can see how I also pulled in that line into the leaf to create a little bit of a middle vein. I also used the same darker brownish green color that I created for the stem or the branches on the leaves on the far left, and also for the stem in the little teeny tiny round leaves at the top. And I used my Van Dyke brown to paint in the twigs that I added here and there. These twigs are just final little details, fillers, if you will, that I decided to add in at the end. Okay, so everything is completely dry, and it was time to paint in a little bit of an illusion of cast shadow beneath these elements to really situate them in place, to make them look like they're actually on a surface. Now, this is completely optional. You don't have to add in the cast shadow if you don't want to, but I thought it would add to this composition, to this arrangement. So what I did was I used my size 4 round brush to pre-wet this entire shape that I created initially with my pencil. I went around all of my elements super carefully, making sure that I didn't add in any water into my different elements, because if I did, my color would expand into these elements that I've already painted in. So I very carefully pre-wetted this entire shape with clean water, which I would recommend changing your water if it's super murky before doing your pre-wetting. And after my entire shape had been effectively and evenly pre-wetted, I went over everything, I would say 3 to 4 times, to make sure that everything was nice and even and that no section would start drying on me way too fast. But once everything had been pre-wetted effectively, I started dropping in my darkest brown. This is my Van Dyke brown with a bit of water in it. And you can see how I started by dropping in this darker brown right along the edges of my elements, because usually you have an occlusion shadow section that is darkest right closest to the elements, where the object or the subject is blocking that light and not allowing it to hit the surface beneath it. And there's no reflected light reaching that area either. So it's always best to start by dropping in your color right next to the object and allow that color to expand out, so that you can have a bit of a more concentrated, saturated look right along the edge of your subject, and then it kind of creates a gradient out. After finishing with my cast shadow, I'm just adding a few more details here and there. I did a little bit more value work with my browns in the 2 central sections of the smaller sunflowers. I just pushed the darker value areas a little bit more to, once again, give those central sections a little bit more dimension. I'm adding a subtle illusion of the central vein of my different leaves with the same color that I use in the actual leaf, and I make sure to go in relatively translucent so that the middle veins and these minor details that I'm adding into the leaves are not super stark. I don't want to add in the central veins for these leaves in a very stark, saturated way and make them just too distracting or too stark looking. So I always go in with one of the colors that I already used to paint in the leaf. And I make sure to go in with this color in a semi-translucent state so that it's not super stark looking. And we are all done. Did you enjoy this tutorial? I really hope you did. And if so, please make sure to check out everything that I'm offering over at my Patreon membership website, because for a very small amount a month, you get immediate access to my most exclusive resources in the form of real-time, step-by-step, fully narrated tutorials that I don't share anywhere else. All of the tutorials that I share over on Patreon include my downloadable outline sketch, my high-resolution reference photos, and my supply lists, including the list of specific colors that I use for the piece on hand. Patreon community members also have access to my weekly sketchbook prompts, which are designed to help you stay consistent and making progress as an artist. There's also a library of classes on art fundamentals that now has over 20 classes in it, and that gets added to each and every month. Monthly live Q&A sessions with me, in which community members get to ask me anything they'd like, feedback from me on your work, and much more. So go ahead and check it out. There are different tiers that you can join that give you access to different things, so you can pick whichever one you need. I'm gonna make sure to leave a link to that down below in the description box. All right, you guys, that is gonna do it for today's video. I really hope that you enjoyed it and that you found it helpful. And if you did, pretty please make sure to give this video a thumbs up, because it really helps support the work that I am doing here on YouTube and helps others get to know about my channel. Thank you so much for watching today. Don't forget to subscribe and click on that little bell so that you can be notified of when I share my new videos, which happens every single week. Have a beautiful rest of the day and see you soon. Bye guys.